What I put inside them, no fox could take. They were 62 ducks, near blind, every one of them, bought for almost nothing from a bankrupt farm at the far end of Cold Fork Valley on a Tuesday morning in May, when I had nothing left but a sick feeling about my potato leaves and just enough coins to do something neither sensible nor safe. I was 63 years old. I had been a widow for 2 years. I had been called a fool by everyone when I had known for 30 years, and I had spent 10 weeks in the Pennsylvania summer heat building something the whole valley agreed was a circus and not a farm. On the morning everything I had built lay broken in the mud, my ducks did not scatter. When I sat down in that mud and could not find the will to rise, 62 near-blind birds that nobody else had wanted heard my whistle and came walking toward me through the wreckage as though the lanes had never mattered, as though what I had put inside them across 8 weeks of patient work was the only thing that had ever mattered. Garrett Webb had 400 acres on the North Ridge. He had the standing of a man who had been right about farming for 30 years and had no reason to believe this summer was different. He had said in the feed store and at the mill and wherever men stood together, talking in the careful, sorrowing voice of a man with nothing but good intentions, that what I was doing out at the Holt place was not farming. He had said it was cruelty. He had said a widow woman alone without guidance had no business making the kinds of decisions I was making. By August, every field he had planted was stripped to bare stalks. Mine was not. I want to tell you how we got from May to August. I want to tell you what I saw when I bent close and no one else was looking. Because a thing worth knowing is worth passing on, and what 62 near-blind ducks taught me in Cold Fork Valley in the summer of 1879 is something I have carried every day since. This is how it happened. Cold Fork Valley ran east to west along a creek of the same name. A clear running creek that came fast in March and slowed to patience by July, and never quite gave out even in the driest summers. That consistency was one of the things that made the valley worth farming, and it had brought families here before the memory of anyone currently living. The farms ranged along both sides of the creek road, some on the flat bottom land near the water, and some climbing the lower slopes of the ridges that closed the valley to the north and south. The families on those farms had been neighbors long enough that their histories were braided together in the way of people who have helped each other in hard times and wronged each other in small ones and kept the peace by mutual agreement not to look too closely at either. Mavis Holt had come to Cold Fork Valley 31 years ago as a bride of 32, which was considered late by the standards of the time and the place, but which had suited her. She had spent her 20s learning midwifery from an older woman in the eastern part of the state, a woman named Ruth Eckerd, who had delivered more than 300 babies in her long career, and who believed that the work could not be taught in the ordinary way of teaching. It had to be absorbed, Ruth said, like heat into stone. Slowly and completely and from the inside out. Mavis had absorbed it. 8 years at Ruth Eckerd's side had given her a quality of attention that other people sometimes found unsettling. She had a way of going very still in the presence of something she was trying to understand, of looking at a thing from every angle before she committed to an interpretation of it that came across as slowness to people who did not know her, and as precision to people who did. Ruth Eckerd had told her once in the blunt way she told things that the difference between a good midwife and a great one was not skill or steadiness, but the habit of looking at what was actually in front of you, rather than what you expected to find. Most people, Ruth said, look at the world to confirm what they already believe. The useful ones look to find something new. Mavis had taken that lesson and carried it into everything she did for the rest of her life. She had married Henry Holt, a quiet carpenter from the western part of the state, who had bought 40 acres in Cold Fork Valley on the sensible belief that the soil and the season were good enough to make a life on. She had moved with him and brought her knowledge with her, and for the next 26 years, she had delivered babies up and down both sides of the creek road. She knew everyone in the valley, not the way neighbors know each other by sight and gossip, and the occasional shared supper. She knew them the way a midwife knows a community, which is to say she had been present at their most stripped and unguarded moments in the rooms where they were most frightened and most hopeful and most entirely themselves. She knew who was brave under pressure and who only appeared to be. She knew which families had weathered real hardship and which had only weathered the idea of it. She knew things about almost every household in the valley that she had never told anyone, not once, in 26 years, because Ruth Eckerd had been clear on the matter and Mavis had believed her. What happens in that room stays in that room. Henry had died 2 winters ago, quietly the way he had lived in his sleep during a cold February night, and Mavis had woken beside him in the gray morning and known before she touched him that he was gone. She had sat with him for a while in the early light, and then she had gotten up and started the fire and told Amos when he came in from the barn, and they had buried Henry in the churchyard on a cold, clear day with most of the valley present, because Henry had been well liked in the way of men who never drew attention to themselves but were always exactly where they were needed. After Henry, she had retired from the midwifery. The farm needed her fully, and she was 61 and a widow, and some things have their season and their season ends. She kept the tools put away neatly in the cedar box Henry had made for them in the corner of the bedroom, where the light came good in the morning. But she still wore the apron. It was the one she had worn to every birth for 26 years. Heavy canvas, tied twice around with deep pockets on both sides, worn dark from use, and a front panel faded from washing to something between blue and gray and pale. Her daughter-in-law had suggested gently, and then a second time less gently, that it might be time to put it away along with the rest of the tools of that trade. Mavis had smiled both times. The suggestion came and put the apron on the next morning, the same as always. It was not stubbornness, or not entirely. The apron was the habit of attention made physical. It reminded her of what her hands knew and what her eyes had been trained to find the habit of looking closely at things, of turning them over and examining what lay underneath. Ruth Eckerd had drilled this into her so thoroughly over 8 years that it had stopped being a skill and had become simply the way she moved through the world. It was wearing the apron the morning she found the eggs. She was walking the potato rows the 3rd week of May, bent at the waist in the way she always walked a field, looking at the plants from the level of the leaves rather than from above. Most farmers walked their rows upright. They surveyed from standing height, taking in the general color and condition of the field, the way you take in a landscape the whole picture at once. Mavis had never been able to walk a field that way. She walked bent the way she had once bent close to hear what was happening at the level where the real work was being done. The eggs were on the undersides of the leaves. She found the first clutch near the north end of the 2nd row orange, and clustered along the leaf veins 30 or 40 eggs pressed together in a tight oval, no larger than her thumbnail. She looked at them for a moment without touching them. Then she kept walking, and kept checking leaf after leaf, plant after plant, moving through the young May growth, while Barley, her old gray-muzzled dog, trailed her at his slow, faithful pace and asked no questions. By the end of the 3rd row, she had found 47 clutches. She straightened up. Her back had opinions about the bending, as it did every morning. Now a complaint she had learned to register and set aside, the way you set aside the things you cannot change and must simply work around. She stood in the potato field with the leaf in her hand and looked at those small orange clusters, and what she felt was not fear. It was the older and quieter sensation she had known at the start of every genuinely difficult case. the settling that happens when a person who knows their work recognizes that the work ahead is going to require everything they have. She knew what the eggs were. The word had been moving through the county all spring, carried from farm to farm with the worried energy that hard news gathers as it travels. Colorado potato beetle. The eggs hatched into larvae. The larvae fed on the leaves, and when the hatch was heavy, they could strip a potato field in a fortnight. She had heard Thomas Cray describe what had happened to a farm east of his just last summer. Stripped to the stalk, Cray had said, in 14 days. Not thinned, not damaged. Gone. She had been in the feed store when Cray said it. She had listened and come home and started checking the undersides of her leaves. That was 10 days ago. She had been finding eggs since the 4th day of checking, and each morning there were more. She tucked the leaf into her apron pocket and walked back across the field. The pocket was deep and worn smooth inside from 26 years of carrying things that needed to be kept close and examined later. It was a pocket made for holding things that mattered. She put the leaf there and walked. Amos was at the woodpile when she came through the yard, working at the steady, rhythmic pace that meant he was thinking about something other than the log in front of him. He was a large man, dark-haired and quiet, with his father's way of going very still when something required his full attention. He saw her face when she came around the corner of the barn, and he set the axe down without being asked. She showed him the leaf. She told him the count. She told him what she knew about the speed of the hatch and what it would mean for a field that went unprotected. She said it plainly and without softening it, because Amos was a man who appreciated plainness and who could be trusted to carry difficult information without falling apart under the weight of it. He took the leaf and looked at the eggs without touching them. Then he handed it back. They were quiet together for a moment in the May morning. He said they would need the powder, the dusting powder, to cover the whole 3 acres. He said it in the tone of a man stating a conclusion he had already worked toward and was not pleased with. She told him the cost. His face did what faces do when the numbers come in wrong. He said they could speak to Webb. Maybe carry the amount against what they already owed. She said she would go. Garrett Webb farmed the largest spread in Cold Fork Valley, 400 acres on the high side of the North Ridge, where the drainage was good, and the sun came early to the rows. He had been farming that ground for 30 years, and selling seed potatoes to half the county for nearly as long, and the combination had given him a standing in the community that was close to authority without quite being it. He was not unkind. He simply occupied his position so solidly and for so long that he had come to believe his view of any farming matter was the only view worth holding. Not from arrogance exactly, but from the honest conviction of a man who has been confirmed in his judgments so many times that he has stopped checking them. He listened to Mavis with his thumbs in his vest and his eyes on the middle distance beyond her shoulder. The expression of a man hearing something he has already categorized. He nodded twice. Then he said what he had been saying all spring to everyone who came to him with this problem. Dust the rows when the hatch begins. Keep to the schedule. Pick by hand through the worst of it. He named a price for the powder she could buy through him. It was more than she had in hand, and more than she had told herself it might be. She asked if there was any room on the account she already carried with him. Just enough to cover the powder for the 3 acres. He was sorry, he said. The credit was stretched as far as he could stretch it. He said it in the tone of a man who is genuinely sorry, but has already decided and would not be revisiting that decision. He added almost as an afterthought that he had told 3 other farms the same thing that week. He said it the way people say things that are meant to be comforting and are not. She thanked him and drove home along the creek road. The numbers on her kitchen table that evening were the same numbers they had been before she went, and they came out the same way they had always come out. The powder cost more than she had. Borrowing the full amount through proper channels would take until summer to arrange, and the hatch would not wait for summer. Hiring enough hands to pick 3 acres clean in a fortnight was a calculation that collapsed before she finished making it. The beetles were coming. The money was not there. She sat at the table with barley under her feet, and the lamp turned low and went through the problem from every direction she could find, the way Ruth Eckerd had taught her to go through a difficult presentation, turning it until you found the angle that let you reach what needed to be reached. She sat a long time and found nothing. She went to bed and did not sleep well. In the morning, she went to town for flour and to ask about a package she was expecting from the East. She told herself those were the reasons. They were true reasons. But she also went because the feed store was where the valley talked, and she had learned decades ago to be in the room where the talking was happening. She listened without contributing much. The talk was all of beetles of cost and shortage, and the inadequacy of every method anyone had tried or heard of. Webb had been through that morning before she arrived, and had given his counsel, and the men were taking it seriously, because they always took Webb seriously, and Mavis stood near the flour barrel and listened and said nothing. She was moving toward the door when she saw the notice. It was tacked to the board near the entrance. The paper slightly damp at the edges, and the ink a little smeared, the kind of notice written in haste by someone with more pressing things on their mind. She read it once, and then stepped closer and read it again. A farm at the far western end of the valley was being taken by the bank. The owner needed to clear his stock before the papers were signed. He had 63 ducks, the notice said. The whole flock. A sickness of the eyes had gone through them the winter before and left most of them with severely compromised vision. They were alive and healthy in their bodies, otherwise the notice said, but they could not see well and were, the owner wrote, in the honest language of a man with nothing left to protect, not suitable for normal use. He was selling the lot for a price so low it was nearly a giving away. 63 near-blind ducks. Mavis stood at the door of the feed store with the potato leaf still in her apron pocket, and those words in front of her eyes, and something happened, in her thinking that she would not be able to explain clearly for many months afterward. It was not a thought exactly. It was the sensation she had known many times in long, difficult labors, the moment when something that has been confusing resolves under your hands into something you can work with. She did not have the whole plan. She had the shape of it. And the shape made her go very still in the way that must have looked strange to anyone watching a 63-year-old woman standing motionless at the door of a feed store on a Tuesday morning in May. She looked at the notice for a long moment. Then she walked out to her wagon and drove home by the long road, the one that ran along the creek, because she needed to think, and the creek road was quiet. That night, she did not sleep at all. She sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and went back deliberately to the winter of 1859. She had been 43 years old that January, but far enough into the work to have learned how to carry fear without showing it, but not so far that the hard ones had stopped being hard. She had been called after dark on a cold night, the ground frozen hard under a crust of old snow, to a farm at the far western edge of the valley she had not visited before. The house was warm when she arrived, full of the smell of wood smoke and the close, warm air of a family waiting together for something important. The woman in labor was the daughter-in-law of the house, a quiet and strong-boned woman from a Mennonite settlement north of the county. Her name was Hildegard. The labor was long and complicated in ways that required everything Mavis knew, and by the gray early morning, She had a healthy child and a mother who was exhausted and relieved in the wordless way of people who have come through something frightening and found themselves intact on the other side. There had been an older woman in the room throughout. She sat near the window and said very little, and was in her way a steadying presence. The matriarch of the house, narrow-shouldered and weathered with the calm of someone for whom birth and difficulty have become familiar enough that they no longer alarm. After the child was settled and the mother was sleeping, Mavis had gone to the window for a moment, rolling down her sleeves. It was not yet full dawn, and the moon was still up and full, and the snow on the ground outside caught that light and made everything bright and pale. In the field behind the house, she could see ducks. They were moving in rows, not wandering the way ducks wander when left to themselves scattered across an open space, following separate curiosities. They were moving in rows, one behind the next, following the lines of the dormant field as though the rows were roads they had traveled many times. She watched them for a long moment, genuinely puzzled. It was January. The ground was frozen. There was nothing visible for them to forage. The old woman had come to stand beside her. She was looking at the ducks with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching something she had arranged. She spoke before Mavis could form a question. Her English was careful and precise, the English of someone who had learned it well in a tongue not born to her. She said her mother-in-law had learned the practice from a traveler who came through Ohio a long time past, a man who had been many places and seen many things. He had told her mother-in-law that in distant lands, places where families had farmed the same ground for far longer than any American could easily reckon, people had never allowed their ducks to wander freely in a working field. They walked them in rows, the same rows in the same order every day, year upon year, generation upon generation. And this practice was so old, the man had said, that no one knew when it had begun. It went back before anyone could remember. Mavis asked why. What was the point of it? The old woman turned and looked at her with the patient expression of someone who is explaining something that ought to be obvious, but is choosing not to make a point of it. She said the man told her mother-in-law that an animal does not need to see far. It only needs to know the ground it is standing on. Then she turned and went back to her chair by the fire. Mavis had ridden home in the cold morning light, turning that sentence over in her mind. She had turned it over many times in the years since the way you return again and again to something that feels like it contains more than you have yet found. The more had always been just out of reach. She had carried the sentence for 20 years, through hundreds of births and long winter nights and the ordinary passage of days, not knowing what she was carrying it for, only knowing that it had the weight of something real. Now in her kitchen in the May dark of 1879, with 63 near-blind ducks available for almost nothing and beetle eggs ripening on the undersides of 3 acres of potato leaves, she understood what the more was. An animal does not need to see far. It only needs to know the ground it is standing on. A duck that cannot see far will not wander far. It will work the ground directly beneath its bill. It will snap at whatever moves at the level of its feet, because that level is the only world it has access to. If you place that duck in a narrow lane, running along the base of a potato plant, exactly where the beetle eggs are laid and the larvae will crawl when they hatch, then the duck's blindness is not a flaw. It is a precision. It will work that strip of ground all day because it cannot see that there is anywhere else to go, and it will be thorough because thoroughness is the only option available to it. The lanes would hold them. Willow wands from the creek, which was full of a willow. Scrap lumber from behind the barn where it had been accumulating for 3 years since Henry had last sorted it. Old barrel hoops for the bends and corners, a pile of them, rusting in the yard, narrow enough that a duck could not turn around, easily could only move forward, bill to the earth through the corridor, running along the base of the plants. Water pans sunk level with the ground at intervals, so the birds could drink without straying to the creek. At night, penned close and tight against the foxes. The ducks themselves would cost almost nothing. The materials were on the property or growing at its edge. The labor was her own and Amos's. She sat with the whole of it for a long time, turning it the way she would turn a plan in a difficult delivery, checking the places it might fail, finding answers to each failure, and checking those answers in turn. The thinking had the quality of a calculation that is sound. Not comfortable, not safe, but sound. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed and slept. In the morning, she told Amos over breakfast. She told him everything in order: the egg count, and the cost of the powder, and the notice at the feed store, and the old woman in the farmhouse at the western edge of the valley 20 years ago, and the sentence that had waited 20 years to mean what it meant. She told it plainly, the way she had always laid out a complicated situation for a family at the start of a difficult labor. All the facts in the right sequence, so that the decision could be made with open eyes. Amos listened without interrupting. His coffee went cold. He set it down. Then he said, "Blind ducks." She said, "Near blind." 63 of them for almost nothing. He went through the objections in order. The birds would need to be fed all summer. They would blunder into the creek. They would trample the plants worse than the beetles. The foxes would take them within a week. Each objection was reasonable, and she answered each one because she had been through all of them in the dark, and she had worked out answers that held. After the last one, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "The whole valley is going to think we have lost our minds." She said the whole valley had thought the same thing when they bought this farm. He said that was not much comfort. She said no. But the beetles are coming, and we do not have the money for the powder, and 3 acres is too much to pick clean by hand in 14 days. Those are the facts I have. This is the only answer I have found that fits inside them. He looked at his cold coffee for a long time. Then he looked at her. "All right," he said. He said it the way his father had always said it, when he had understood something fully, and was committing his back and his patience to it. They went that same afternoon. The Birch Run farm sat at the far western end of the valley, and it looked like what it was, a place that had been in trouble for longer than just this year. The buildings needed work. The fences listed. The yard was churned to mud, where drainage had been left unattended too long. The man who met them at the gate was younger than Mavis had expected, not past 40, and he kept his eyes toward the ground in the way of someone who has decided that shame requires this posture and is paying the cost of it faithfully. He was not a careless man. She could see the care in small things, the way the water troughs had been kept clean, the way the remaining feed was stored properly. He was a man who had done his part well and been overrun by things outside his part, and he had not yet sorted out what that meant about him. The ducks were worse than the notice had admitted. Their feathers were dull, and their eyes had the glazed quality of creatures that have lost a primary sense and not yet found all their ways around the loss. They bumped the fence posts. They tilted their heads at sounds they could not locate. One stood in the corner of the yard and moved its head slowly from side to side, parsing the world by ear and smell and the feel of the ground beneath its feet, making do with what remained. Another walked with the careful placement of a creature that has learned to distrust the ground, testing each step before committing. Amos counted out the coins. There were not many. The man took them without counting and helped load the birds into the slatted crates Mavis had thought to bring, and he did it without much talking, and Mavis let him do it that way because some griefs are not helped by words. The drive home was slow and quiet, except for the sounds from the wagon bed. 63 ducks settling into their uncertainty with the patient compliance of creatures that have no strong theory about what happens next. Barley rode beside the crates and monitored the situation without commentary, simply present the way he had always been present for anything that mattered on the Holt farm. They came up their own lane in the late afternoon, the light going amber in the west, and Roland Peck was at his fence on the north boundary, occupied with a fence post in the way of a man who has found a task that allows him to face the road at exactly the right moment. He looked up at the wagon, and then at Mavis, and then at the crates, and she could see him assembling the information with the quick efficiency of a man who has made it his business to know things about his neighbors before his neighbors know them about themselves. She looked straight ahead and kept the mare at her pace. They unloaded the crates in the yard as the last light faded and opened them, and 63 near-blind ducks found their feet on the ground of the Holt farm, uncertain and murmuring, tilting their heads at the smell of the creek and the sound of the barn and the unfamiliar grass beneath them. Barley sat beside Mavis and watched the proceedings with the ancient patience of an old dog that has learned to take most things without commentary. From down the road came the sound of Roland Peck's horse moving faster than a man going home for supper had any reason to move. By morning, everyone would know. Mavis stood in her yard in the fading light and watched the ducks settle and did not worry about what morning would bring. She had done the thinking in the dark, and the thinking was sound, and the work ahead was clear. The lanes would go in tomorrow. The lumber was behind the barn. The willow was by the creek. The ducks were on the ground. She put her hand in the deep pocket of the midwife's apron and felt the potato leaf still there, curled and dry at the edges. The small orange eggs on its underside, unchanged by anything that had happened since she put it there. She left it there and went inside. The lanes went in the next morning before the dew had dried off the grass. Mavis was up before first light, which was her habit, and had been since her midwifery years when the calls came at all hours, and the body learned to be ready without waiting for the sun. She was in the potato field with the long measuring string by the time Amos came out of the barn, and she had already walked the first row twice and driven in the corner stakes before he had finished his coffee at the yard edge. She showed him what she needed. She was precise about it, not because she doubted his intelligence, but because the margins were real, and the precision was where the thing would either hold or fail. The lanes had to be narrow, not wide enough that a duck could turn around comfortably inside them, wide enough that the bird could move forward freely, bill down along the base of the plants, but no wider than that. She showed him with her hands how wide. She walked the row herself to demonstrate the alignment, the way the inside edge of each wall should sit no more than 3 inches from the base of the potato plants, because that was the ground the eggs would hatch onto and the larvae would crawl through. Amos listened and looked at her stakes and asked 2 questions. She answered both. Then he went for the lumber. The materials behind the barn were considerable in their variety and modest in their quality, which was the ordinary condition of a working farm that had been standing for 30 years. There were boards of 3 different widths, some gray and warped. Others split at the ends but sound through the middle. There were barrel hoops of various sizes, red with rust on the outside. There were lengths of rope coiled and hung on nails with the orderliness of a man who had believed in keeping things that might still have use. Henry's orderliness. She touched one of the coiled ropes as she passed and kept moving. None of what was here was what a carpenter would choose if starting fresh. All of it was what they had. Mavis went to the creek while Amos began pulling boards. The willows along Cold Fork Creek had been growing undisturbed for a long time, and they were generous with their new growth. Long, supple shoots that bent without snapping when she tested them. She cut with the pruning knife, taking the young ones, the ones new enough to have the give she needed, and she cut a great many of them, more than she thought she would need, because she had learned from the midwifery that running short of materials at a critical moment was a crisis that could be avoided by the simple discipline of taking more than you expected to use. She cut until her arms were full, and then cut a second load and carried them to the field in 2 trips, her back noting the weight, and she noting what her back said and continuing. She had been building the first section for perhaps 2 hours when she understood the error. The lanes were too wide. She stood at the entry of the first completed lane and looked at it with the measuring stick in her hand, and the unease of a person whose calculation has come out wrong in a way she cannot immediately locate. She put the stick down and went and got a duck from the temporary pen. One of the calmer ones, a bird that had settled more quickly than the others since their arrival. She set it in the lane. The duck turned around, not with difficulty, with ease. It simply rotated inside the lane space and faced the other direction, which was exactly what a duck in a working lane must never be able to do. She looked at the lane. She looked at the duck. She looked at Amos, who was watching her from the other end, with the careful expression of a man who has seen the problem before she named it and is waiting to see what she will do with it. She said, "Take it apart." Amos did not say anything. He set down his hammer, and they worked from opposite ends of the section, pulling the board stakes up from the soft earth, dismantling 2 hours of work in 30 minutes and carrying the boards back to the staging pile to be reset at the corrected width. Mavis remeasured. She redrove the marker sticks. She worked without speaking, because the error had been hers, and the correction was hers, and there was nothing useful to say about either. She simply corrected it and moved forward. The second version of the lane, narrower by 4 inches, she tested with the same duck. The bird could not turn around. It could move forward or it could move backward, but it could not rotate. And a duck that cannot rotate will, after brief experimentation, choose to move forward, because forward is where the bill naturally leads and where the senses point. She put the duck back and they kept building. They finished before the light failed that evening, and Mavis stood at the field's edge and looked at what they had made. Low walls of willow and weathered board running between the potato rows in narrow lanes knee-high, each one aligned along the base of the plants from one end of the section to the other. Water pans sunk level with the ground at intervals she had calculated would keep a duck drinking without losing its concentration on the work at its feet. At the lane ends, small gates of hoop and willow she could open and close to move the birds from section to section. The structure was strange to look at. She had known it would be strange, and she looked at it without apology. She brought the ducks in the morning. Setting them into the lanes was not the orderly process she had imagined in the kitchen, in the May dark. The ducks placed in the narrow spaces, one at a time, did not comprehend what was expected of them, and expressed this with considerable energy. They pressed against the willow walls. They sat down in confusion. A few doubled back on themselves and jammed against the bird behind them, causing a ripple of complaint that traveled the length of the lane. One found the water pan she had sunk at the first interval, and stood in it with the contented absorption of a creature that has discovered water in an unexpected place and intends to appreciate it fully, which was not the intended use of the pan, but at least confirmed the pan was the right depth. Mavis crouched at the entrance to the nearest lane and rested on her heels in the way she had sat beside women in labor for 26 years, close and patient, and not alarmed by noise or confusion, waiting for the process to find its course. She reached into her apron pocket for the grain she had put there before coming out, and let a small amount fall just inside the lane entrance, close enough that the duck nearest her could smell it. The duck tilted its head. It stepped forward and found the grain with its bill. She let another small fall a little farther in. The duck followed. It was the work of a full day. It required her complete attention, and all the patience she had built up across decades of sitting with people who were frightened and in pain and needed her to be steadier than she felt. She stayed at it through the morning and into the afternoon. Amos came and crouched beside her, and she showed him what she was doing, and he took the other end of the row and worked from that direction. And gradually, over the course of that long first day, something shifted. They stopped fighting the walls. It happened the way most animal learning happens, without announcement, one bird at a time. A duck that had been pressing against the willow for an hour would suddenly stop pressing and take a step forward and put its bill to the ground and find something there. A beetle already crawling at the base of the plant, or a grub disturbed by the boards, and snap it up and take another step. And then another. By the end of the first day, perhaps a third of the ducks were moving with something resembling purpose, through their lanes' bills to the earth, shuffling forward in the narrow space, as though they had grasped the terms of it. That night, Mavis sat on the porch steps with Barley's old head on her knee and looked at the dark shape of the potato field and felt something she was careful not to call confidence. It was the feeling she had known at certain moments in difficult labors, the feeling that the thing is moving in the right direction, that what is needed now is not more cleverness, but steadiness. She was careful with the feeling, because she had also learned that things moving in the right direction can reverse, and it is better not to claim victory before it arrives. By the third day, the ducks had learned the lanes. It happened with a completeness that surprised her, even though she had believed it would happen. She came out in the early morning of the third day and opened the pen gate, and the ducks came into the field and entered the lanes in the unhurried but purposeful way of creatures following a path they know. A blind animal has this gift. It learns its world the way a person learns a house in the dark, by the sound of it and the feel of it underfoot, and the way the air moves in certain places, and when the learning is complete, it moves through that world with a sureness that has nothing to do with sight. By the third morning, the ducks had learned the Cold Fork Valley potato field lane, by lane, pan by pan, corner by corner, and within that learned world, they were not clumsy at all. They were thorough. She watched them work through the long June mornings, crouching at the lane ends, to see their bills moving along the base of the plants, snapping at the larvae that had begun to hatch from the orange eggs. The larvae hatched soft and pale, and moved in the only direction that made sense to them, which was down toward the dark and the moisture and the roots. They crawled down the stalks and across the ground and into the path of 63 bills that happened to be working that ground from first light to late afternoon. The earth at the base of the plants went clean. She turned the lower leaves every morning in the first week and found fewer and fewer larvae. The eggs were darkening as they ripened, and the newly hatched larvae dropped, and the ducks took them methodically, lane by lane, and the soil below the plants was cleared, the way a floor is cleared, by someone who has enough time and nowhere else to be. For perhaps 5 days, she let herself believe the worst was past. Then she climbed to the upper leaves. She had known this possibility. She had thought about it in the dark and told herself the lower hatch would be the bulk of it, that the upper leaves were a smaller problem, that the damage there would be manageable. She had told herself this because the problem of the upper leaves did not have a clean solution inside the plan she had made, and it is a human failing to defer the problems that do not fit neatly into the solutions already in hand. The upper leaves were not a smaller problem. The larvae that had hatched and survived the first days, the ones that had hatched high enough to begin feeding before they dropped, had grown. They were no longer the soft, pale crawlers of the early hatch. They had the striped backs of the second stage, and they were feeding with the committed efficiency of creatures that have found good food and intend to eat until it is gone. They were on the upper leaves, leaves the ducks could not reach because the ducks could not see them, and their bills were working at ground level, while the beetles fed in osity 2 feet above. The field was winning at the bottom and losing at the top. She stood in the lane and looked up at the underside of a high leaf and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not yet in her favor. She called to Amos from across the field. He came, and she showed him what was on the leaves, and he looked, and she could see him arriving at the same numbers. They would have to shake them down. There was no other answer that fit inside what they had. Walk the rows twice a day, and shake the plants so the larvae fell to the lane floor where the ducks were working, bringing the food to the level of the bills that could eat it. It was brutal work in the way of all necessary physical labor that has no elegant substitute. The plants needed to be shaken firmly enough to dislodge the larvae, but gently enough not to damage the stems. A distinction that required attention and the willingness to be wrong and correct the wrongness as you went. 3 acres bent double under the Pennsylvania June sun, while your back communicated its complete and detailed opinions on the matter, was the kind of work that settled into your bones at night and was still there when you rose the next morning to begin again. Her hands blistered by the 4th day of shaking. The blisters broke, and she wrapped the worst of them in strips of clean cloth from the house and went back out the next morning the same as always. The cloth worked loose before noon, and she rewrapped it and kept going. By the 5th day, the skin beneath the broken blisters had hardened into something rougher than what had been there before. And by the 6th day, she had stopped noticing the hands entirely and had moved on to noticing her knees, which communicated their situation with a directness she could not ignore, but had learned to file alongside everything else that was true and could not be changed. Amos said nothing about his own hands. She did not ask. There was a conversation that happens between 2 people in hard shared labor that requires no words and asks nothing of either person except that they keep moving, and they were having that conversation every day. Some mornings she came out to find him already in the rows before she had finished tying her apron, which she took to mean that he had found his own way of handling the weight of it. They simply went out and bent double and did the work. The ducks grew sleek and content on the steady forage. Their feathers came in better than when she had brought them the dull, flat quality of underfed birds, giving way to the slight sheen of animals eating well and consistently. They began laying eggs in the corners of the pen each morning, more than the 2 of them could use, and Mavis set the extra in straw and took them to trade in town when she went for supplies. It was not much, but it meant the birds were no longer pure expense and had begun to return something toward their keeping. The valley watched. Roland Peck came by twice in the first week after the ducks arrived, and both times stood at the fence in the easy manner of a man who has found something that will give him interesting things to say at the feed store and is not in any hurry to move on. He called a greeting to Amos and asked generally how things were going over there and did not wait for a complete answer. He was not hostile. He was the kind of man whose chief pleasure is information about his neighbors and who does not see this as any kind of failing. Others stopped as they passed on the road. Most said little or nothing. A few asked questions of the kind that are really observations in disguise. One man stood at the fence for nearly 10 minutes without speaking at all, and then rode on without explanation. Mavis did not go to the fence to engage any of them. She had the lanes to tend and the ducks to move and the larvae to shake down, and she did not have time or inclination to explain herself to people who had not asked in good faith. What she was not told directly, and what reached her anyway, was what Garrett Webb had begun to say. It reached her on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of June, when she went to the general store in town for salt, and the woman at the counter, a woman named Agnes, who had always been straightforward with her in the manner of people who respect each other without being close, paused before wrapping the salt and said something was going around that Mavis might want to know. She listened. Webb had been at the feed store the previous Saturday and the Saturday before. He had not said anything harsh directly. He was too careful for that, too practiced in the craft of shaping opinion with the soft tools of implication and expressed regret. What he had said in the considering tone of a man troubled by what he was obliged to report was that keeping birds in narrow enclosures, where they could not see or move or forage freely, was a recognized form of cruelty to animals, that what was happening in those lanes out at the Holt place was not farming, but something he found difficult to characterize with charity. He said it without anger. He said it with a sorrow that made it worse, as though he had tried to find another interpretation and been unable to. The cruelty charge. It was the thing she had not reckoned on fully, and standing in the general store with the salt in her hands, she felt the coldness of it settle through her in a way the laughter had not managed. Laughter she had prepared herself for. She had known since the night she made the plan that it was strange enough to be funny, and she had made a kind of peace with being laughed at by people who had not yet seen what she had seen. But cruelty was a different matter entirely. A midwife builds her standing on the trust of a community. She goes into people's homes at their most frightened and most exposed. The standing rests entirely on the belief that she means well and does well, that her judgments can be trusted in the dark hours. The cruelty charge was aimed directly at the foundation of that standing, and it had nothing to do with potatoes. She thanked Agnes and took her salt and drove home. She did not say anything to Amos that evening. She sat with it herself through the night, the way she had always sat, with the heaviest things in her own company first, until she understood them clearly enough to speak about them without the weight distorting what she said. She went out after supper to check the ducks walking the lanes in the long midsummer light, turning the lower leaves and finding them clean. Watching the ducks settle in the pen with the contentment of creatures that have worked a full day and found it satisfying. They were healthy. They were visibly well fed. Their feathers were coming in better than when she had brought them. They moved to their water with the comfortable authority of ducks that know exactly where their water is. They were not suffering. Anyone who came and looked with open eyes could see that they were not suffering. No one came and looked. That was the coldness of it. That Webb's words would spread among people who had driven past the fence at a trot and caught a few seconds of the lanes and formed their picture from those seconds, shaped by what they had heard rather than what they had seen, and they would not come to look closely, because looking closely requires some willingness to have your picture changed, and not everyone carries that willingness. She put it in the place where she stored the things she could not change, and went to bed. It was the following week that Eli Brand came. She heard the knock at near midnight, which startled Barley into a brief hoarse bark before he recognized it as a knock and subsided. She lit the lamp and went to the door in her robe. The young man on the porch had the look of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say all the way down the road, and was now discovering that none of it sounded right in the actual moment of saying it. He was perhaps 26, lean and sun-darkened, with the hands of someone who had been working without help for longer than was good for him. He had a small farm at the south end of the valley, 2 years established. He had borrowed money to plant his first full crop. The beetles had found him the same as everyone else. He asked if he could speak with her. She told him to come in, and she put the kettle on, and she let him take the time he needed to find the words. It did not take very long once he stopped trying to make them polite. He was losing everything. His field was 3/4 gone. He had tried the powder and run out of money for more. He had picked by hand until his wife was picking beside him, and his hands had cracked and bled. He had heard what was being done on the Holt place, and he did not care if it was strange or if people were talking. He only wanted to know if it would work, and if she would tell him how. She listened to all of it. She let him finish completely. Then she told him the truth, which was not what he had come for. She told him she did not know yet. She had been watching the field every day for 3 weeks, and the signs were good, and she believed she was right. But believing and knowing were 2 different things, and she could not teach what she had not confirmed with her own eyes on her own ground. If she told him the method and the method failed, he would have spent the time he needed for salvage on building lanes for birds that did not work. She could not hand him that risk when she was still carrying it herself. He sat at her kitchen table in the lamplight, and she watched him absorb the refusal and the reason for it. And she could see how much the reason cost him, because a sound reason does not save a field. She told him she was sorry. She meant it completely. He thanked her and went home. She stood at the window and watched the small lamp of his lantern moving away down the road through the dark. And she stayed at the window longer than she needed to, because watching him go was its own kind of hard thing, and she did not want to rush past the weight of it. The rain came at the end of the third week. It came in the way of the serious rains of that part of Pennsylvania. Not a summer shower that moves through and leaves the air sweet, but a slow, heavy soaking that settled in for 2 days and showed no intention of hurrying. The ground, which had been dry and cracked in the June heat, could not take it fast enough, and water stood in the low sections of the field and ran along the lane floors. The lanes were not built for sustained rain. She had angled them for drainage when they went in, but she had been working fast with materials at hand, and the angles were not consistent. Some sections drained toward the creek as intended. Others did not. By the end of the first day, the lower sections were waterlogged, the ground soft enough that the board stakes were shifting in it, the willow walls beginning to sag where they had been anchored in earth that had gone to mud. She was out in it with the old coat over the canvas apron, tapping stakes back into alignment, bracing the sagging walls with creek edge rocks carried armful by armful, while the rain kept coming and the mud kept deepening. Amos worked the other half of the field. The rain made everything slower, and the results of the fixing were temporary at best. She tapped a wall straight and moved to the next section, and when she came back, the first had shifted again. The ducks were coping better than she had expected, which was perhaps not surprising, since they were ducks and rain was not foreign to them. They moved through the flooded lanes with the acceptance of waterfowl, and some of them were clearly finding the situation agreeable, stopping at the places where standing water had pooled, and doing the contented duck thing of sifting water through their bills with an air of deep satisfaction. It was on the second morning of the rain that the wall went down, a 6-foot stretch in the middle section, where the ground had become too soft to hold anything upright, simply fell outward and lay flat. She was at the other end of the field when it happened, and she heard the increased complaint from the ducks before she saw the cause. By the time she reached the broken section, 3 ducks were out of the lanes and moving in the direction of the creek, which they could smell from anywhere on the farm, and which their instincts were sensibly telling them was preferable to wherever they currently were. Amos went in after them, without pausing to remove his boots, straight off the lane edge and through the broken section and down the wet slope, toward the creek margin where the ducks were moving, with the determined, unhurried pace of birds that have made up their minds. He got ahead of them and turned them and walked them back, and it took the better part of an hour, and he came back with all 3 birds and mud from his boots to both knees and a face that said he was keeping his opinion to himself by a deliberate effort of will. She thanked him and repaired the wall. That evening, the rain stopped. The sky cleared to the west, and the sunset ran long and orange across the valley, and the fields steamed gently in the cooling air. She walked the lanes in the dusk and turned the lower leaves. Clean. The ducks had not stopped working through the rain and the mud in the fallen section. They had worked all of it, and the lower leaves were clean. Amos was at the porch steps when she came back through the yard. He had cleaned the mud from his boots and was sitting with something hot in his hands and his elbows on his knees and the look of a man who has been composing what he is going to say for some time and has not yet found a version he is satisfied with. She sat down beside him and waited. He said he had been into town that afternoon while she was walking the field. He said it quietly in the tone of a fact he is required to report, rather than a choice he is making. He said he had been at the mill briefly and had heard things while he was there that had been said loudly enough that no one present could have been unaware that he was hearing them. She asked what was said. He told her, longer versions of what Agnes had told her, with the additions that 3 weeks of repetition gives to an idea being carried by someone who knows how to carry ideas. The cruelty was at the center. And around it, the suggestion that a widow farming without proper guidance was perhaps not in a position to make these kinds of judgments that concern, was the appropriate response, not criticism. He was very still when he said it. She had known him since he was born, and she knew this quality of his stillness, the way he went completely quiet, when what he was feeling was too large to contain through any normal channel. He was angry on her behalf, which she had expected, but there was something underneath the anger, and it took her a moment to find it. He was ashamed, not of her, not of the ducks or the lanes or any part of the plan. He was ashamed of the fact that he had stood in the mill and heard those things said, and had not found the words to argue them, and that the failure to argue had felt in the moment like a kind of agreement. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Come with me." She took the lamp from inside the door and went out to the field without explaining where she was going or what she intended to show him. She walked the first lane from the pen end to the creek end, with the lamp held low, the light falling across the base of the plants, and she turned the leaves as she went. One after another, the lower leaves, the leaves at the height the ducks worked. She turned them and held the lamp close and showed him what was there. Nothing. Leaf after leaf, nothing. No eggs, no larvae, no damage at the base of any plant. The lowest 12 inches of every plant in that lane were clean in a way that 3 acres of untreated potato plants in the middle of a beetle hatch in Pennsylvania in the summer of 1879 had no business being clean. She moved to the next lane and showed him the same. She moved through 4 lanes. Then she straightened up and faced him in the lamplight. She said, "We are 10 days from the end of the worst of the hatch. The lower leaves are clean. The upper leaves have less each day. We are winning this, Amos. Slowly and hard and barely. But we are winning." He took the lamp from her and crouched and turned leaves himself slowly, with his father's way of giving a thing, his full attention before he said anything about it. He moved the lamp and turned more leaves. He was silent for a long time. Then he stood and blew out a slow breath. She knew what it cost him to hold to her account against what he was hearing in town, to carry a truth he could not easily demonstrate to people who had already decided what they thought. She did not make it smaller than it was. He took the lamp back to the house, and she stayed a moment in the dark field and listened to the ducks settling in the pen, the low murmurs of birds going still after a long day's work, and to the creek moving in the willows at the field's edge, and to the ordinary sounds of a summer night in Cold Fork Valley. By the count she had been keeping from the first eggs she found, this was the 22nd night since the hatch had begun. 10 more. She went inside. She woke in the dark of the 7th night to Barley's head, lifting off the floor beside her. The old dog was suddenly fully alert, in a way she had not seen from him in years. His body gone completely still with his ears up and his attention fixed on something she could not see from the bed. She lay still and listened. From the direction of the pen came a sound, not the low, contented settling of ducks in the night. Something faster and more frightened. A scattering, a rushing. The panicked sound of birds surprised by something their impaired eyes cannot find and their instincts cannot reason with. She was through the door before Amos's lamp came on in the barn. The gate was off its hinge. She saw that first, in the pale pre-dawn light, the gate listing outward against the fence post, the latch pulled half out of the ground, where something had driven at it from outside, with enough force to shift the post in its hole. The pen was empty in the places the ducks should have been, and the sound she could hear now told her that empty was not the same as gone. She stood for a moment at the gate and assessed. This was the discipline Ruth Eckerd had drilled into her before all others. Before you act, see clearly what you are dealing with. A wrong response made in haste is worse than a right response made a minute later. She stood, and she listened, and she looked at what the gray light showed her. Along the post and on the ground near it, she could make out the prints, the narrow-paired ovals of a fox. A single animal by what she could read. It had found the pen in the night and worked at the gate until the post gave. She looked at the pen floor and found no blood in quantities that would mean serious loss. She called to Amos. He was at the barn door with a lamp, and she waved him toward the field, and they went in separately. She to the north end and he to the south, moving through the rows in the pre-dawn dark. The ducks were everywhere. They had gone in all the directions available to a near-blind bird in a night panic, which is every direction at once guided by the sound of the creek, and the smell of the field, and the feel of the ground, and the accumulated fear of whatever had come in the dark. Some had found their way back to the lanes and jammed there, pressed against the walls in the tight fear of small creatures caught in a narrow space. Some were standing lost in the open ground between lane sections, calling in the high, anxious tone of birds that do not understand their situation. A few had made it to the open field beyond the lane ends and were moving in the direction of the creek, with the steady, purposeful pace of ducks that have reached a decision. She found 62. The count she came to when she moved through the field systematically north to south was 62. She did not find the 63rd. She found its feathers later at the creek edge where the fox had crossed back to the other bank. One bird, that was what the fox had come for and taken. But it was not the lost bird that sat heaviest when she turned from the creek edge in the growing light and looked back at the field. It was the lanes, the section in the middle of the field, the section where the ground had never fully recovered from the rain, had been walked flat by the traffic of the night. 62 panicked birds moving in the dark, pressing against walls that were already compromised by a week of wet ground, had done what the rain alone had only begun. The boards lay down in the mud. The willow walls were trampled or pushed apart. 3 full lanes and part of a 4th had collapsed into a section of bare mud and scattered lumber with no more structure than a brush pile. She stood at the edge of the damage and did the count that mattered. 2 days. The hatch had 2 days left before it ran its course and spent itself. 2 days and 1/3 of the lanes lay flat, and 62 ducks were scattered across 3 acres in the early morning, and she was a 63-year-old woman with blistered hands and a back that had been registering its opinions about this work for 3 weeks without receiving any satisfactory response. There was not time to rebuild what was broken. Not in 2 days. Not at the pace she and Amos could work and still maintain the rest of what the field needed. Her knees found the ground. She did not choose to sit down exactly. It was more that the decision to remain standing became one she could not make, and her body found its own answer to the question of what to do when there is too much weight for the legs to carry. She sat in the mud of the Cold Fork Valley potato field in the early morning of the 8th day, and she let the full weight of it land on her without trying to push any of it back. The fox had come on the 8th day, not the 1st day, not the 5th. The 8th day when 2 days remained, and the thing had been nearly won. She had sat in that dark field with Amos and shown him the clean undersides of the leaves and told him 10 days, and he had stood and blown out a long breath, and they had both believed it. The 8th day, 2 days from the finish. She sat in the mud and thought about Henry, about the way he had said all right when he had understood something fully and was committing himself to it. She thought about the man at the Birch Run farm, the young man who had kept his water troughs clean and stored his feed properly and done his part well and been overrun anyway. She thought about Eli Brand going home through the dark with nothing she had been able to give him. She thought about Webb's voice in the feed store and Agnes at the counter, and Amos standing in the mill, unable to find words. She thought about 26 years of learning to look at things the way they actually were, and she thought about whether she had been wrong, whether the confidence she had felt in her kitchen in the May dark had been the sound confidence of a person who had found a true answer, or the false confidence of a person who needed there to be an answer and had seized on the nearest available one. She thought about Ruth Eckerd. Ruth had told her once that the hardest part of the work was not the difficult labors. The hardest part was the long middle stretch of a difficult labor. The hours after the fear of the beginning had passed and before the relief of the end had come, when everything hurt and nothing was resolved, and the only thing that could be done was to keep doing what you had been doing and trust that the process was moving, even when you could not feel it move. Ruth had said, "That is the only time that matters. That is the only time that proves what you are made of." She sat in the mud and thought, this is that time. Barley came. She had not seen him leave the house, but here he was, moving through the ruined lane entrance with the slow, arthritic placement of his old legs, navigating the broken boards and collapsed willow with the patience of a dog that has learned to take difficult ground one careful step at a time. He came to where she sat in the mud, and he lowered himself beside her with the careful difficulty of his years, and he put his gray muzzle on her knee. She put her hand on his head. They sat together while the morning came up around them, the light growing slowly, the field resolving out of the gray dawn into its actual state, the broken section in front of her and the standing sections on either side, and the creek willows beyond, and somewhere in all of it, 62 ducks that had not gone as far as she had feared. Amos came around the south end of the field with 3 birds ahead of him, walking them with his arms held wide, and guided them through the temporary bar he had put across the gap where the gate had been. He came and stood beside her and looked at the broken section. He did not say anything. He understood that there was nothing to say that would be useful, and so he said nothing, and she was grateful to him for exactly that. She sat with Barley's head on her knee, and she looked at the broken lanes, and she thought about the old woman at the window. The memory came the way memories come when you are very still and very tired, and the problem in front of you is larger than ordinary thinking can find a way around. Not a recollection she reached for, but a presence. The narrow-shouldered woman standing at the farmhouse window in the January of 1859, looking out at the ducks moving in their rows across the snow-bright field. The way she had turned, the careful English, the things she had said about her mother-in-law and the traveler from Ohio, and the people in distant lands who had kept this practice since before anyone could remember. An animal does not need to see far. It only needs to know the ground it is standing on. She had understood those words in May, sitting in her kitchen, as a principle of construction. She had understood them as the reason the blind ducks in a narrow lane would work the ground directly beneath their bills. The blindness and the lane together, the 2 things working in combination to hold each bird where the work was. She sat in the mud now on the 8th morning, looking at 62 ducks distributed across the broken field, and she understood something else. Something the sentence had contained that she had not yet reached. The lanes were the teaching. The lanes had never been the thing itself. For 8 days, the ducks had walked those lanes. They had walked them before first light, and in the full heat of the day, and in the long evening, before Amos whistled them to the pen. They had walked them hundreds of times across 8 days, and they knew the ground now. Not the boards, not the willow, the ground itself. The smell of the potato plants at their base, and the feel of the lane floor underfoot, and the sound of the water pans at the intervals, and the whistle she used to move them, the low, two-note whistle that had meant forward all summer long. She looked at the ducks still standing in the field. They had not gone far. She could see that now that the light was fuller. The ones nearest the creek edge were not past the willows. The rest were within the field, most of them within 20 yards of a lane entrance, some of them already drifting back toward the lanes by the pull of habit, the deep-grooved habit of 8 days of the same path, walked hundreds of times. They were not gone. They were lost in the open field the way they had been lost in the lanes on the very first day, confused by the absence of the structure they had learned. But on the first day, they had not known the structure. Now they did. She understood that the lanes could be set down because the ducks carried everything the lanes had put into them, and what was carried inside a creature does not fall apart when the structure around it falls apart. The lanes had been walls. The whistle was something else. The whistle was something she had given them that lived inside them now, and it was still there, and it had not been touched. She put her lips together. She whistled. The two-note whistle low and clear in the morning air. The one that had meant forward for 8 days. The one that had meant come this way, keep moving. This is the direction. The ducks lifted their heads, not all of them at once, but one and then 3 more, and then a cluster of them near the lane end turned and oriented toward the sound, the way a compass needle orients toward north because the sound was the one familiar thing in an unfamiliar situation. And a near-blind bird in an open field will move toward the familiar with the same certainty it moves toward everything else it has learned to trust. They came toward her, wobbling, murmuring, some of them listing to one side, in the way of birds navigating by ear rather than eye, some of them pressing against each other as they converged, but coming, walking toward the whistle the way they had walked toward it every morning for 8 days because that was what the whistle meant, and that was what they had learned, and the learning had gone somewhere inside them that a fox and a broken fence and a night of terror had not touched. What I put inside them, no fox could take. She understood that now, sitting in the mud, with the broken field in front of her and Barley's old head on her knee, and 62 near-blind ducks moving toward the sound of her whistle through the gray morning light. She stood up. She stood up out of the mud, and she wiped her hands on the canvas apron, and she looked at the field, and she looked at Amos standing at the field edge watching her. She walked to the fence line where she had stacked willow wands for wall repairs, and she took 2 of the longest ones, and she went back to the field. She did not rebuild the lanes. There was no time, and there was no need. The ducks had learned what the lanes were built to teach them, and the teaching was complete, and the tool that had done the teaching could be set down. What she built instead was simpler, and had been available to her all along. 2 people with long willow wands, one on each side of a moving flock, walking behind the birds, the way a shepherd walks behind sheep, guiding the mass of them down the rows by the gentle, steady pressure of presence and motion. She showed Amos. She held up one of the wands and looked at him across the heads of the assembling birds, and he came into the field and took the other, and they positioned themselves behind the flock, one on the left and one on the right, and she whistled and the ducks moved. It was, she realized, as the morning went on, faster than the lanes had ever been. The lanes had been fixed structures through which the birds had moved in sequence, one behind the next, each bird working only the ground its lane covered. Now she and Amos moved the whole flock together, 62 bills working the ground simultaneously across the width of 3 or 4 rows at once. And when she whistled and angled her wand, the whole mass shifted in that direction, concentrating on the sections where the larvae were thickest, spending the force of 62 appetites on the worst stretches and moving on when those stretches were clean. Where larvae clung to the upper leaves, Amos walked ahead and shook the plants, and the larvae rained down, and the flock came through immediately behind him, 62 bills ready. She could aim them now. She could move the force of this work to wherever it was needed most, and she could do it with a whistle and 2 willow wands. The lanes had given her a system. The broken lanes had given her something better. They worked the whole field that first day, from first light to last. Her feet were wet, and her back was the kind of tired that sits between pain and numbness and stops distinguishing between the two, and her hands on the willow wands had opened the old blisters and made new ones. Amos said nothing about his own state, and she did not ask because the asking would have cost them both something they could not spare. They moved the flock to the pen at dusk, and she went inside and ate standing at the kitchen counter, because sitting down felt like a commitment she might not be able to reverse. The second day was the same in all the ways that mattered. Out before the light was full, the same slow, steady walking of the rows, Mavis at the back and left Amos at the back, and right, the flock between them, working the ground. She kept her attention on the sections that had been heaviest with the upper leaf infestation, and she drove the flock through those sections twice. The ground they left behind was clean. By the noon of the second day, she walked back over a row she had already walked 3 times that morning and found the ground behind the plants entirely clean. She moved to the next row and found the same. She walked 6 rows in sequence, crouching at each to examine the base of the plants and the soil and the lower leaves, and found nothing that was not supposed to be there. She stood up and looked at the Pennsylvania sky above Cold Fork Valley, which was the uncomplicated blue of a summer afternoon, with a few high, thin clouds moving slowly east. She walked the whole field one more time, slowly turning leaves at intervals with the methodical care she had once used, checking a patient after a long, difficult labor. Not because she expected to find a problem, but because being methodical was the difference between knowing and assuming. She found 3 more larvae in the full length of that final walk. 3. She left them for the ducks and kept walking. At the far end of the field, at the creek end, she stopped and looked back at the 3 acres. The plants ran from the fence to where she stood in clean, unbroken rows. The leaves were full and dark. The stalks were upright. No skeletal lace, no stripped stems, no pale bare stalks. The field had held. She reached into her apron pocket. The potato leaf she had been carrying since May was still there, dry as old paper, now pressed flat by weeks of being carried in the deep canvas pocket. She took it out and looked at it in the evening light. The orange eggs were long gone, hatched and eaten and finished. The leaf itself was yellowing at the edges, past its season, past its use. She stood at the creek end of the Holt potato field on the last evening of the beetle hatch and looked at the dry leaf for a long moment. Then she let it go into the creek, and the water took it downstream without ceremony, and she watched it until it was out of sight. The county fair that year fell on the 3rd Saturday of August, as it always did, and by the time it came, the talk in the valley had been shifting for weeks. The way opinion shifts when evidence accumulates past the point where it can be comfortably ignored. People had been watching the Holt field from the road all summer. They had watched the lanes go in and heard Webb's careful words and watched other fields go down, fields that had been dusted on schedule and picked by hand exactly as Webb had recommended. They had driven past the Holt field in July and seen the green rows and told themselves it was too early to say anything. They had driven past in August, and the field was still green, and the beetles had finished their course, and there was less they could tell themselves now. Webb was still careful, the way he was always careful, He had modulated his position across the summer in small increments, adding qualifications, softening assertions, noting that unusual conditions can produce unusual outcomes. He had not said he was wrong. He had arranged his words so that being wrong, if it came to that, would read as having been given incomplete information rather than having refused to see what was in front of him. Mavis had heard all of it, second and third hand. She received it without visible reaction, which was a practice she had built across decades of being present in rooms where emotion ran high and where her own visible reaction had the power to amplify whatever was already there. She was at the vegetable display at the fair, standing behind her potatoes and preserves, when she heard the conversation begin at the far end of the tent. She did not move toward it. The tent was not large, and a conversation that carries is a conversation that is meant to carry. The other people near her were already orienting toward the sound. The voice was Webb's. She knew it before she turned her head. He was saying what he had been working toward saying all summer, the settled final version of the position he had constructed, which was that the Holt results were real, but that a single outcome on a single farm did not constitute a proven method, that what the Valley needed was not to abandon reliable practice for experiments that had worked once in conditions that could not be replicated. He said it well. He had always said things well, and she had always been aware that this was a different skill from being right. Then another voice, young, careful, choosing words with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to say something in a public place and has spent the walk over thinking about how to say it. She turned her head slightly without turning her body. Eli Brand was standing near the center post of the tent, his hat in his hands, speaking toward Garrett Webb and the men gathered near him. He said he had come to Mavis Holt in the night during the 3rd week of June, when his field was 3/4 gone. He said he had asked her to tell him what she was doing on her place and how to do it because he had heard about it and was desperate and had nothing left to lose by asking. He said she had refused him. The tent went quiet in the way that tents go quiet when something is being said that everyone present understands matters. Eli Brand said she had refused him because she did not yet know with certainty that her method worked and she would not teach a thing she had not confirmed with her own eyes on her own ground. She had told him she was sorry. He believed she was sorry. He had gone home and made the choice that was left to him, which was to follow Webb's advice with the money and time he had remaining, and his field was gone by the end of July, and he was carrying debt into the next season with nothing from this one to show against it. He said he was not at the fair to blame Garrett Webb for that. He had made his own choice. He was there because he needed the people in that tent to understand one thing clearly. Mavis Holt had known enough about the limits of her own knowledge to refuse to teach what she was not yet certain of. She had been honest about what she did not yet know, and she had stayed in her field for 10 weeks in the heat and the rain and the mud and worked the thing until she was certain, and she had been right. He said he intended to go to the Holt farm that winter and ask her to teach him what she now knew, and he believed she would teach him, because a woman who had worked that hard for that long, for something that was true, would not keep the truth to herself once it was confirmed. He said he was telling the Valley this now, so that when she taught him, and when the rest of them came, nobody would be confused about where the knowledge had come from and what it had cost to earn it. He put his hat back on. The tent stayed quiet. Webb stood near the tent entrance with his face doing the arithmetic that a man's face does when the numbers have come out against him. He was a fair man underneath the standing he had built. She had believed this all along. A fair man who had been wrong and who had been in Cold Fork Valley long enough to understand that the manner in which he handled this moment was what people would remember when they had forgotten the rest of the summer. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the tent. He crossed it without hurry, without the hurry that would make the crossing look like something he was rushing toward before he could change his mind. He stopped in front of her, and he took his hat off. He said her name. He said, Mrs. Holt. He said it with his voice carried out to fill the space. The tent provided the same way he had said things all summer that he had wanted heard. He said he owed her an apology and intended to make it at the same volume and in the same places as the things he had said all summer that were wrong. He said he had called her method foolish. He had been wrong. He had said things about the treatment of her animals that were unjust, and he had known they were likely unjust when he said them, and had said them because they were useful to his position. And that was the part of it he was most ashamed of. He said she had seen something the rest of the valley had walked past, had worked it out on her own ground, at her own cost, and the field at the end of it was the answer to everything else that might be said. He said he would be glad to learn from her if she was willing. She looked at him for a moment, not with coldness and not with warmth, but with the measured regard she had given over 26 years to the things that were simply true and required acknowledgement as such. Then she said she was willing. The winter that followed was the busiest she had known since the last years of her midwifery. They came in ones and twos through the cold months, men from both sides of the creek road, sitting at her kitchen table with their caps in their hands while she explained it all. The narrow lanes, the critical width, the drainage angles, the water pans sunk level with the ground, the training of the birds, the grain scattered at the lane entrance, the slow, patient work of the first 3 days, the whistle and why the whistle mattered as much as the lanes, perhaps more than the lanes, because it was the whistle that remained when everything else came down in the night. She explained what the last 2 days had taught her, the part she had not planned and would not have known without the fox and the broken lanes. That once the ducks had learned the lanes themselves were no longer necessary. That 2 people with willow wands could move a trained flock through an open field and aim them where the infestation was worst, and that this was faster and more effective than the fixed lanes because it could be directed rather than merely deployed. That the structure was the teaching, and the teaching, once complete, could be carried without the structure. She taught it the way Ruth Eckerd had taught her, the difficult things fully and without abbreviation, not because the learning was easy, but because the difficulty of learning the right way was better than the cost of learning the wrong one. She sat at the kitchen table through those cold months, and she gave every person who came what she had spent a summer, earning the right to give, and she did not hold any of it back. Some of them came skeptical, which she understood. A thing does not stop being strange simply because it has been proven to work. She let them be skeptical at the start, and she answered their questions without impatience, and she showed them when they were ready to be shown the logic that sat underneath the strangeness. She told them what she had told Amos on the morning she decided the beetles are coming, and there are only so many things that fit inside the facts you have. A strange answer is not a wrong answer. The habit of looking at the underside of a thing, of turning it over, before you decide you know what it is, was worth more than any single piece of knowledge she could give them. Eli Brand was the first to come the week after the fair, exactly as he had said he would be. He sat at the table and listened with the quality of attention that belongs to people who are learning something they had previously paid too much for not knowing. He asked good questions. He stayed with the parts that were not immediately clear until they became clear. When he left, he thanked her, in the quiet way of a person to whom information has been genuinely and practically useful. She watched him ride away down the creek road in the November cold, and she thought about the cost of the refusal, what it had taken from him, and what it had cost her to refuse. She had been right as it turned out, but that was not the thing she thought about most. The thing she thought about was that she had been right to refuse, even not knowing she would be right, that the refusing had not depended on the outcome, that a person who only holds to the truth when the truth is convenient has not really held to it at all. Sometimes it takes 40 years and a summer in the mud and 62 near-blind ducks to be ready for a thing. That was all right. Being ready when you got there was enough. She went inside. The spring came early to Cold Fork Valley that year, the ground softening in the second week of March, and the creek running high and sweet. By the end of the month, the willows putting out their new growth along both banks, in the long, pale green of early spring. She walked the potato field on the first dry April morning, with Barley behind her at his slow, faithful pace. She walked it the way she had always walked, a field bent at the waist, looking at the undersides of things. The ground was soft from the March melt, and her boots left shallow prints along the rows. She checked the lower leaves of the early plants and turned them over and found nothing, except the clean undersides of leaves that had not yet been troubled. She had walked this same field last May with a dull feeling of dread and a leaf full of orange eggs in her pocket. She walked it now in April with a feeling. She did not have a name for, not quite confidence and not quite peace, but something made of both, something that came from having been through a thing and found that you could be through it and still be standing at the end. The new lumber was in the barn, proper milled boards that Amos had brought from the mill in February. Enough for the full 3 acres of proper lanes with some left over for repairs. The pen had been rebuilt over the winter with proper post and rail, fencing tight and solid, in a way the original pen had never quite been tight enough that a fox would find no angle worth trying anywhere along its length. The 62 remaining ducks were in the pen. They had wintered well, better than they had wintered at the Birch Run farm that had given up on them. She looked at them through the pen rails on that April morning and thought about what she had thought many times over the winter, that they were the strangest and in some ways the most reliable labor the Holt farm had ever employed. Eli Brand arrived at the lane end as she was coming back from the creek with the first load of willow. He had his own wagon and his own tools, and he had brought 2 men with him, and he stood at the lane end holding his hat and asked if she would be willing to have him and his men help set the new lanes in exchange for her supervision of the work so he could see the construction done correctly before he put in his own. She looked at the wagon and the tools and the men waiting quietly beside it, and she said yes. They built the new lanes over 3 days. Proper milled boards set at the correct angle drainage cut as she directed water pans placed at the intervals she had determined across the summer were most effective. The lanes were better than anything she had built from scraps in the spring before, and watching them go in was the kind of satisfaction that comes when an idea has moved from its rough first form into something that has been thought all the way through and built to last. On the 3rd morning, with the lanes finished and Eli Brand's men loading the wagon, she stood at the field entrance with Barley at her heel and watched the ducks come out of the pen. They came in the order. They always came the larger ones first, the smaller ones filing in. Began moving out of the pen gate with the unhurried ease of birds that have done this before and expect to do it again. They entered the field and spread into the new lanes without instruction from her, without the grain in the lane entrance and the slow, patient coaxing of the first days a year ago. 5 months of winter had been between them and this ground, but they moved into the new lanes as though they had walked them yesterday. Bills went down. The soft, steady sound of ducks working the earth moved along the rows in both directions from where she stood. She stood and watched. Barley sat and watched with the absolute attention of an old dog that knows when something matters without needing to be told why. The April light came long and flat across the field from the east, catching the top edges of the new boards and lying across the potato rows, the way light always lay across Cold Fork Valley in early spring, the long gold of a morning in a place that has come through winter and is still discovering the warmth it had forgotten was coming. She put her hand in the deep pocket of the canvas apron. The pocket held nothing now but the familiar worn weight of itself. The leaf had been in the creek since October, long gone downstream to wherever the Cold Fork Creek took the things it carried. She kept her hand in the pocket anyway, feeling the worn canvas, the smooth inside the pockets that had held so many things across so many years, that they had stopped being pockets and become something more like the shape of a life's work, held close to the body. She thought about the narrow-shouldered woman at the window of the farmhouse at the valley's western edge, the January of 1859, the careful English, the ducks moving in their rows across the snow, bright field. She thought about the long, cold ride home through the morning, turning a sentence over and over, without yet knowing what it was for. She thought about the 20 years it had waited, in her patient and unopened until a Tuesday in May, when she had stood at the door of a feed store with a beetle egg in her apron pocket, and the shape of an answer had arrived whole and certain. This was how knowledge moved. Not through proclamation, not through the authority of men who had farmed the same ground so long they had stopped turning over the leaves. Person to person, moment to moment, carried in the memory of someone who did not yet know why they were carrying it, waiting in the dark for the morning when it became the only answer that fit the facts at hand. She had been that carrier for 20 years without knowing it. Now others would carry what she had confirmed. Eli Brand riding home down the creek road with it. The men who had sat at her kitchen table through the winter months. The valley that had watched and laughed and gone quiet and come to look and learned something about what it means to see clearly and what it costs to keep seeing when the whole world has agreed to look away. She looked at her field one more time. The ducks moved in their lanes. Eli Brand's wagon made a small shape at the lane end, moving away down the creek road toward his own ground, where his own lanes would go in this week. The April sun came across the valley and lay warm on the back of the canvas apron and on Barley's gray head, where he leaned his old weight against her leg. She left her hand in the empty pocket and watched her 62 near-blind ducks working the ground. No one else had found a way to work, and she thought of the old woman at the farmhouse window, in the snow, bright January dark, and the words she had given to a young midwife who happened to be standing at the right window at the right moment, and the 20 years those words had waited, and what they had become when they finally found their use. It only has to know the ground it is standing on.